want to talk about an issue, whether capitalism is humane and what you mean by it. The arguments, the issues in this debate which has been going on for so long about the form of government have changed. The argument used to be about strictly the form of economic organization. Should we have government control of production and distribution, or should we have a market control? And the argument used to be made in terms of the supposedly greater efficiency of centralized government. Nobody makes that argument anymore. There is hardly a person who will claim that nationalized industries or socialism is an efficient way to organize things. The interesting thing is that nonetheless, there is widespread opposition to capitalism as a system of organization, and there is widespread support for some vague system labeled socialism. What is it that produces this attitude of anti-capitalism and pro-collectivism among intellectuals? I think there's a simpler reason for this. A supposed emphasis on moral values, ignorance and misunderstanding about the relationship between moral values and economic systems. The emphasis on moral values is almost always on the part of people who do not have economic problems. It's not on the part of the masses. But the problem with this approach, the problem of trying to interpret and analyze a system, either pro or con, in terms of such concepts as the morality of the system or the humanity of the system, whether capitalism is humane or socialism, is that moral values are individual, not collective. What our own individual values are. Capitalism, socialism, central planning are means, not ends. They, in and of themselves, are neither moral nor immoral, humane nor inhumane. We have to ask, what are their results? What are the consequences of adopting one or another system of organization? From that point of view, the crucial thing is to look beneath the surface. Socialism, which means government ownership and operation of means of production, has appealed to high-minded, fine people, to people of idealistic views, because of the supposed objectives of socialism, especially because of the supposed objectives of equality and social justice. Now, those are fine objectives, and it's a tribute to people of good will that those objectives should appeal to them. But you have to ask, does the system, no matter what its proponents say, produce those results? Once you look at the results, it's clear they do not. Where are social injustices greatest? Social injustices are greatest where you have central control. The degree of social injustice, torture, and incarceration in Russia is of a different order of magnitude than in the Western countries, where most of us have grown up and in which we have been accustomed to regarding freedom as our natural heritage. Social injustice in China, where you have had thousands of people murdered because of their opposition to the government. You have in a country like Soviet Union enormous inequality in the immediate literal sense that there is a small select group that has all of the services and amenities of life and very large masses on a very low standard of living. The wage rate of foremen versus ordinary workers in the Soviet Union was much greater than in the United States. Capitalism, on the other hand, relies on private property and voluntary exchange. It has repelled people. It's driven them away from supporting it because they have thought it emphasized self-interest in a narrow way, because they were repelled by the idea of people pursuing their own interest rather than some broader interest. If you look at the results, it's clear that the results go the other way around. It's in the capitalist societies of the world, where only where capitalism has prevailed over long periods have you had both freedom and prosperity. The greatest measures of freedom, the large, few would deny that in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, in Germany, in Western Europe, we have a greater degree of freedom on an individual level than in most other places. Freedom has prevailed where you've had capitalism, and that simultaneously so has the well-being and the prosperity of the ordinary man. There's been more social justice and less inequality. It encourages, supports, and develops in the people who live under that system. What we're concerned with in discussing moral values here are those that have to do with the relations between people. It's important to distinguish between the morality relevant to each of us in our private life, how we conduct ourselves, and systems of government and organization are the relations between people. And in judging relations between people, it's not to force them to do good. The fundamental value is to respect the dignity and individuality of fellow men. Treat your fellow man not as an object to be manipulated, but as a person with his own values and rights, a person to be persuaded, not coerced, not forced, not brainwashed. That seems to me to be a fundamental value in social relations. In all systems, whether socialism, capitalism, or anything else, people act from self-interest. The citizens of Russia act from self-interest in the same way as the citizens of the United States do. The difference between the two countries is what determines self-interest. The man in the United States who is serving as a foreman in a factory, his self-interest leads him to worry about not getting fired. The man in Russia who is acting as foreman in a factory, his self-interest leads him to worry about not being fired at. Both are pursuing their own self-interest. But the effects, what makes it in their self-interest, is different. Self-interest should not be interpreted as narrow selfishness. And more fundamentally, whenever we depart from voluntary cooperation and try to do good by using force, the bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. The essential notion of a capitalist society is voluntary cooperation, voluntary exchange. The essential notion of a socialist society is fundamentally force. If the government is the master, if society is to be run from the center, you ultimately have to order people what to do. What is your ultimate sanction? Whenever you try to do good with somebody else's money, you are committed to using force. How can you do good with somebody else's money unless you first take it away? The only way you can take it away is by threat of force. A policeman, a tax collector. If you have a socialist society, an organization from the center, government bureaucrats running things, that can only ultimately rest on force. Whenever you resort to force, even to try to do good, you must not question people's motives. Assume their motives are good. There's an old saying about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. You have to look at the outcome. The bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. Not only that, you've all heard it, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's one reason why trying to do good with methods that involve force lead to bad results. Because people with good intentions are corrupted. And I may add, if they're not corrupted, they're replaced by people with bad intentions, who are more efficient at getting control of the use of force. The most harm is done when power is in the hands of people who are absolutely persuaded of the purity of their instincts and of the purity of their intentions. Thoreau said that philanthropy is a much overrated virtue. Sincerity is also a much overrated virtue. Heaven preserve us from the sincere reformer who knows what's good for you, and heaven is going to make you do it whether you like it or not. That's when you get the greatest harm done. I have no reason to doubt that Lenin was a man whose intentions were good. A major factor has been because of a change in the philosophies which have been prominent in society from a belief in individual responsibility to a supposed belief in social responsibility. From a tendency to get away from the individual, from his responsibility for his own life and his own behavior, to a belief that, after all, it's society that is responsible. If you adopt the view that everything belongs to society, then it belongs to nobody. Why respect property if it belongs to everybody? If you adopt the view that no man is responsible for his own behavior, because society is responsible. Then, why should he seek to make his behavior good? Don't misunderstand me. It's true that what we are is affected by the society in which we live and grow up, of course. All of us are different than we would have been if we had grown up in a different society. I'm not denying the effect of social institutions within which we operate, both on our values and our opportunity. But I am only saying that a set of social institutions which stresses individual responsibility, which stresses a responsibility of the individual, given the kind of person he is, the kind of society in which he operates, to be responsible for himself, is a kind of a society which is likely to have a much higher and more responsible moral climate than the kind of a society in which you stress the lack of responsibility of the individual for what happens to him. If you're going to use the doctrine of social responsibility, you ought to be even-handed both ways. It excuses both the victim and the person alleged to be responsible for the victimization. We must all be individually responsible for what we do to our fellow men, whether harm or good. We have made immoral behavior far more profitable. We have been establishing greater incentives to behave in ways most regard as immoral. In the last 30 and 40 years, as Britain has been moving away from essentially laissez-faire and toward a much more controlled and centralized economy, this reputation for law obedience is disappearing. You've had repeated scandals about ministers of the government, about members of parliament, about civil servants who have been bribed, about the rise in gang warfare and the rest. Why? Because you're establishing an incentive. You've got more laws to break. It's fundamental. When the only laws are those which everybody regards as right and valid, they have great moral force. When you make laws that people separately do not regard as right and valid, they lose their moral force. Here are people who would never dream for a moment of stealing a nickel from their neighbor, have no hesitancy manipulating their income tax returns to reduce their taxes by thousands. Why? Because the one set of laws have a moral value that people recognize independent of the government having passed these laws. The other set do not appeal to people's moral instincts. Prohibition of liquor had disastrous effects on the climate of law obedience and morality. Something which had been legal, to buy and drink some alcoholic beverages, became illegal, and you converted law-abiding citizens into bootleggers. I go back, however. Essence of capitalism is a system of cooperation without compulsion, of voluntary exchange, of free enterprise. I hasten to add, no actual system conforms to that notion. In the actual world, you're always dealing with approximations. The essential character of a capitalist system is voluntary exchange. Both parties to the exchange must benefit. This was a great vision of Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, that individuals pursuing their own self-interest could promote the social interest because you could get exchange between people on the basis of mutual benefit. This notion extends beyond economic matters. I want to give you some different examples. Consider the development of language. The English language. There was never any central government that dictated the English language, that set up some rules for it. There was no planning board that determined what words should be nouns and what words adjectives. Language grew through the free market, through voluntary cooperation. I used a word, you used a word. If it was mutually advantageous, language grows, it develops, expands, it contracts through the free market. Consider an academic institution. How did scientific knowledge and understanding arise? In the history of science, that isn't the way science developed. Science developed out of free market exchange, voluntary cooperation among scientists. If they don't, you build a more complicated system through voluntary exchange based on the principle of mutual benefit. Similarly to a free market in ideas. Again, that is a free market of exactly the same kind as the economic market, and the two are very closely interrelated. I want to give you a final example. It goes back to the fundamental question we've been raising, and that's voluntary charitable activity. Go back to the 19th century in the United States. It was a period when you had about the closest approximation to a capitalist society The federal government was spending roughly 3% of the national income, almost entirely on the Army and Navy. State and local governments were spending about 6 or 7% of the national income, mostly on schooling. Very little of what has come to be regarded as welfare activity. Yet the 19th century was a period of the greatest burst of voluntary charitable activity in this country or any other. The Carnegie libraries, the free public library. Why was it that voluntary activity flourished? Because again, the free market, voluntary cooperation among people, cooperating to pursue their common interests, is a far more effective and efficient way of producing charitable results than any other known to man. What is a common element in all of these cases I've mentioned? Language, common law, scientific knowledge, ideas, charitable activity. The development of an elaborate and complex structure without central planning and without coercion. You develop complex mechanisms, complex structures, with order, with structures which after the event you can analyze in logical terms. Without coercion, you have progress through harmony rather than coercion. Money is not a noble motive, but it's cleaner than most. Who has produced the great achievements of mankind? Can you name a great play written by a government committee, an invention produced by a government bureau? The great works that are the great achievements of mankind have all been the achievements of individuals, of a Shakespeare or a George Bernard Shaw. There are no societies today more materialistic than collectivist societies. It's the Yugoslav societies that put their stress on materialism, achieving economic goals and 5-year plans that destroy the non-materialistic achievements of mankind. They are in a position to suppress minorities. What we want for a society that is at once humane and gives opportunity for great human achievements is in a society in which that small minority of people who do not have materialistic objectives, who are interested in some of these other achievements, have the greatest degree of freedom. The only society that comes close to doing that is a capitalist society. When you hear people objecting to the market or to capitalism, and you examine their objections, you will find that most of those objections are objections to freedom itself. What most people are objecting to is that the market gives people what the people want instead of what the person talking thinks the people ought to want. Marx or an Engels or a Lenin to the market. The important thing is that in that kind of society, it's also hard to do harm. If you had a concentrated power in the hands of an angel, he might do a lot of good, as he viewed it. But one man's good is another man's bad. The great virtue of a market capitalist society is that by preventing a concentration of power, it prevents the harm concentrated power can do. Capitalism is not humane or inhumane. Socialism is not humane or inhumane. But capitalism tends to give free rein, much freer rein, to the more humane values of human beings. It tends to develop a climate which is more favorable to the higher moral atmosphere and greater achievements in human understanding.